She said at my promotion party, "Don't let this go to your head. You're still the same loser I met." Everyone went silent. I raised my glass and said, "You're right. I am the same guy. The one smart enough to know when to walk away." I left her there with my coworkers. Monday morning, she was waiting in my office parking lot. Let me start from the beginning. I, 34M, had been grinding for 8 years at Henderson and Associates, slowly climbing from junior analyst to senior project manager. The promotion to department head came with a corner office, a substantial raise, and respect I'd never felt before in my professional life. My wife had watched this journey from the sidelines, offering occasional encouragement, but mostly remaining focused on her own career as a marketing coordinator. The company threw a celebration at the Riverside Country Club. I'd invited her weeks in advance, explaining how important this night was for me. She showed up 20 minutes late in a dress that looked like she'd grabbed it from the back of her closet, clearly having rushed from whatever had been more important than supporting her husband's biggest career milestone. The evening started well enough. My colleagues congratulated me. The CEO gave a speech about my dedication, and I felt genuinely proud of what I'd accomplished. I noticed she seemed distracted, checking her phone frequently and barely engaging with the conversations around our table. When my boss mentioned the new responsibilities I'd be taking on, she rolled her eyes so obviously that the woman across from us noticed. The moment that changed everything happened during the toast. I stood up, feeling confident and grateful, ready to thank everyone who'd supported me. The room quieted as I raised my glass, and that's when she decided to speak. Her voice cut through the silence like a blade, telling me not to let this go to my head because I was still the same loser she'd met 7 years ago. The silence that followed was deafening. I could feel every eye in the room on us, could see the shock and embarrassment on my colleagues' faces. My boss looked mortified. The CEO's wife actually gasped. I felt something inside me snap, not with anger, but with a strange kind of clarity I'd never experienced before. I kept my glass raised and my voice steady as I told everyone she was absolutely right. I was the same guy she'd met all those years ago, the one smart enough to recognize when it was time to walk away. I thanked everyone for coming, set my glass down, and walked out of that ballroom without looking back. The drive home was the most peaceful 20 minutes I'd experienced in months. I didn't turn on the radio, didn't call anyone, just drove through the quiet streets thinking about how different I felt. When I got home, I went straight to the spare bedroom and started gathering my things. She arrived 30 minutes later, storming through the house demanding to know what I thought I was doing. She tried to explain it away as a joke, claimed I was overreacting, accused me of embarrassing her by leaving. I continued packing while she talked, folding clothes with the same methodical precision I used for everything else in my life. When she realized I wasn't responding to her usual tactics, she shifted to tears, then to anger, then back to bargaining. I spent that weekend in a hotel, using the time to think clearly about our relationship for the first time in years. The patterns became obvious when I had space to see them. She'd always been quick to diminish my achievements, had never attended work events without complaint, regularly made jokes at my expense in front of friends and family. I'd explained it away as her sense of humor, her way of keeping me grounded, but sitting in that hotel room, I realized I'd been making excuses for someone who didn't respect me. Monday morning brought the promotion party aftermath I'd expected. A few colleagues asked if everything was okay, but most were professional enough to pretend nothing had happened. My assistant mentioned that my wife had called several times, but I asked her to hold all personal calls. I had work to focus on, a new team to manage, and responsibilities that required my full attention. I was reviewing quarterly reports when my assistant buzzed in to say there was a situation in the parking lot. I looked out my office window and saw her car parked directly behind mine, blocking my exit. She was leaning against her hood, arms crossed, clearly prepared for a confrontation. The security guard was already approaching her vehicle when I made it downstairs. She saw me coming and immediately launched into what I could only describe as a performance. She talked about how we needed to discuss things like adults, how I couldn't just throw away 7 years of marriage over one bad night, how she'd been under stress at work and hadn't meant what she'd said. I asked the security guard to give us a moment, then told her we could talk, but not here, not at my workplace where she'd already caused enough embarrassment. She suggested coffee at the place we used to go on weekends, and I agreed to meet her there after work, hoping we could have a civilized conversation about ending our marriage. The coffee shop conversation lasted 2 hours and accomplished nothing. She alternated between apologies and justifications, never quite taking full responsibility for what she'd done. She talked about counseling, about working on our communication, about how couples go through rough patches. I listened patiently, but my mind was already made up. Some lines, once crossed, couldn't be uncrossed. When I told her I'd already spoken with a lawyer, her demeanor shifted completely. The tears disappeared, replaced by a calculating look I'd seen before but never directed at me. She started talking about what she was entitled to, about the house we'd bought together, about the years she'd supported my career while putting her own on hold. It was fascinating to watch someone reveal who they really were when they thought their security was threatened. I'd actually done my homework. The house was in my name, purchased with money from an inheritance my grandfather had left me before we met. Her career had been her choice. I'd never asked her to limit her ambitions. In fact, I'd encouraged her to pursue opportunities she'd shown interest in, only to watch her lose enthusiasm when the work got challenging. The lawyer I'd consulted had been thorough. Our state wasn't particularly favorable to lengthy marriages, especially when both parties worked and had no children. She could make claims, of course, but she'd have to prove significant contributions to my career success, and embarrassing me at a company event wasn't exactly evidence of support. She must have consulted her own lawyer, because the next week brought a series of increasingly desperate attempts at reconciliation. She sent flowers to my office with notes about how much she missed me. She called my mother, painting herself as the victim of my sudden personality change. She even reached out to my sister, hoping to recruit family support for her cause. But she'd miscalculated how much people had noticed our dynamic over the years. My mother, ever diplomatic, told her she thought we both needed time to figure things out. My sister was less tactful, mentioning several occasions when she'd been uncomfortable with how my wife spoke to me in public. Even her own friends seemed to have mixed feelings about the situation. The real revelation came when I started hearing from colleagues about conversations she'd had with them over the years. My assistant mentioned how my wife had once complained to her about my long hours, implying that I was using work to avoid home responsibilities. A coworker from another department told me she'd always found my wife's comments about my appearance and habits at company events to be inappropriate. I realized I'd been living in a bubble, accepting behavior that everyone around me recognized as problematic. The promotion party incident hadn't been an aberration. It had been the logical culmination of years of subtle disrespect that I'd normalized. Update 1. 3 weeks after that parking lot confrontation, I was settling into my new role and enjoying the peace of living alone in a furnished apartment. The divorce paperwork was moving forward smoothly, with her lawyer quickly realizing their position wasn't as strong as they'd initially hoped. I was actually happier than I'd been in years, throwing myself into work and rediscovering interests I'd neglected during my marriage. That's when she escalated her approach. She started showing up at places she knew I'd be. My gym, the grocery store I shopped at, the restaurant where I'd begun having dinner with colleagues after work. It never quite crossed the line into harassment, but it was clearly calculated to keep herself in my line of sight. The breakthrough came when she approached one of my coworkers at a bar where several of us had gone after a particularly successful project completion. She tried to get information about my social life, asking whether I was dating anyone, whether I seemed happy, whether I'd mentioned her. My coworker, uncomfortable with the situation, told me about it the next day. I realized she was operating under the assumption that I was going through some kind of midlife crisis, that given enough time and pressure, I'd come to my senses and return to our previous dynamic. She couldn't conceive that someone might actually prefer being alone to being with her, that her presence in my life had been more burden than blessing. The final straw came when she contacted my new boss, the one who'd promoted me, under the guise of planning a surprise congratulations dinner. She wanted to know my schedule, my favorite restaurants, whether the company might be willing to contribute to a celebration. My boss, confused by the approach, called me directly to verify the details. I had to explain that we were separated and that any surprise she might be planning would be unwelcome. My boss, clearly uncomfortable with the personal nature of the conversation, assured me that all future contact from her would be redirected to me directly. But the damage was done. She'd once again brought our private issues into my professional life. That evening, I called her and told her this behavior needed to stop immediately. I explained that any further contact with my workplace, my colleagues, or my family would result in a restraining order. She tried to argue that she was just trying to fix our marriage, but I cut her off. There was no marriage left to fix. There was only a legal process to complete. Update 2. The restraining order wasn't necessary. After that phone call, she finally seemed to accept that her strategy wasn't working. The divorce proceeded without further drama, with her eventually accepting a settlement that was fair but not generous. She moved out of state within a month of the papers being signed, claiming she'd found a better job opportunity, though I suspected she simply couldn't handle living in the same city where everyone knew how our marriage had ended. 6 months later, I ran into her best friend at a coffee shop. We'd always gotten along well, and she looked genuinely happy to see me. During our conversation, she mentioned that my ex-wife had been struggling with the transition, that she'd expected me to fight harder for the relationship. Her friend seemed almost relieved to tell me that several people in their social circle had admitted they'd never understood what I saw in her, that they'd always thought I was too good for her. It was validation I hadn't realized I needed. For years, I questioned my own perceptions, wondering if I was too sensitive, too demanding, too focused on minor issues. Learning that others had noticed the same patterns confirmed that my decision had been based on reality, not some distorted view of our relationship. The promotion turned out to be everything I'd hoped it would be, and more. Without the constant stress of managing my wife's moods and reactions, I threw myself into the new role with enthusiasm. My team responded well to my leadership style, and within 6 months, we'd exceeded our performance targets by 15%. The CEO mentioned my work specifically during the quarterly board meeting. I started dating again. Nothing serious, just casual dinners and social events with women who seemed genuinely interested in getting to know me. The contrast was striking. These women asked about my work with genuine curiosity, celebrated my successes without qualification, and treated me with basic respect that I'd forgotten was normal in adult relationships. One woman, a teacher I met through a friend, mentioned after our third date that she found it attractive how passionate I was about my career. She said too many men she dated seemed ashamed of their ambitions or felt the need to downplay their achievements. I realized I'd spent 7 years with someone who'd made me feel guilty for being successful, who'd treated my professional growth as a personal threat. Update 3. A year after the divorce was finalized, I received an unexpected email from my ex-wife. She'd heard through mutual friends about a major project I'd led that had been featured in industry publications. She wanted to congratulate me and suggest that we might be able to maintain a friendship now that the emotional aspects of our separation had settled. I read the email several times, looking for any hint of the woman who'd publicly humiliated me at what should have been one of the proudest moments of my career. The tone was carefully neutral, almost professional, as if she were contacting a former colleague rather than someone she'd shared a bed with for 7 years. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I thought about what purpose maintaining contact would serve. We had no children, no shared business interests, no compelling reason to remain connected. Our social circles had already naturally separated, and I'd found that I didn't miss any of the friendships that had been primarily hers. After a week of consideration, I sent a brief response thanking her for the congratulations, but indicating that I preferred to keep our lives separate. I wished her well in her new city and new job, but I made it clear that I had no interest in friendship or ongoing contact. She replied almost immediately, a much longer message expressing hurt at my coldness and confusion about why I couldn't forgive someone who'd admitted their mistakes. She talked about growth and maturity, about how we could both learn from what had happened, about the value of maintaining connections with people who'd been important in our lives. I realized she still didn't understand what she'd done wrong. In her mind, she'd made a mistake during a stressful period, had apologized, and should be forgiven. She couldn't see that the promotion party incident had simply been the moment when her true feelings about me became impossible to ignore. She'd revealed something fundamental about how she viewed me, and no amount of explanation or apology could undo that revelation. This time, I didn't respond at all. 2 years later, I'm engaged to the teacher I mentioned, a woman who shows up early to my work events and beams with pride when I receive recognition. She's never once suggested that success might change me or that I should downplay my achievements. When I was promoted again last spring, she planned a celebration dinner and insisted on calling both our families to share the news. Sometimes I think about that moment in the ballroom when my ex-wife chose to humiliate me in front of my colleagues. I wonder if she ever realizes that she didn't just end our marriage that night. She freed me to find someone who actually wanted me to succeed. The revenge she never saw coming was simply me walking away and building a better life without her. The best part is that she'll never understand that her cruelty was actually a gift. She showed me exactly who she was, and more importantly, she showed me who I could be when I wasn't constantly defending myself against someone who was supposed to love me. That's a lesson worth more than any apology she could ever offer.